Darwin, everybody thought that man came into existence in one instant, 4,000 years before, according to the Bible, according to a literal reading, somebody's literal reading in the Bible. And that Darwin overthrew that theory and used dinosaur bones to prove it. Now this is just not true, and he didn't claim that himself. What happened was there was a phony debate in England by the Church of England. They said, if what Mr. Darwin is saying about evolution is true, that proves there's no God. If there was previous history before, 4000 BC, that proves there's no God. I don't think it proves any such thing. But, it was a badly conceived debate. Darwin actually wrote about what he said was the way that nature changed. Why does nature change? Why do new species come about? Why do animals change from generation to generation? And how did he account for that change? He said that, well, it's sort of like what happens in the business world. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The rich animals succeed and the poor animals get crushed. And they get arrested and they die. But that's kind of stupid. That's not really a very scientific theory. He was taking British politics and putting that into natural science. That's not really a very scientific thing to do. It's easy to prove there were dinosaurs. And anybody who says that they weren't, or that they came from flying saucers or what have you, is not paying attention to what's being discussed. Darwin wrote his book after studying Malthus. And he said, Malthus has given me a great light. And he wrote his book in 1859 when there was one great subject before the world, and that subject was black chattel slavery. It was the most violently argued about, most important subject at the time in the world. Because the following year, Abraham Lincoln would be elected president. The British would give guns and ammunition and money to the slave owners' rebellion in their last attempt to physically break up the United States. And the people who thought like Malthus in the world, like these old Dark Age creatures that wanted to have feudalism come back to the world, they preferred empires where people worked as serfs without thinking, and a few people sat in a banking office somewhere in a city off in another country. Darwin was on the side of the Southern Confederacy in the U.S. Civil War. Now, most people in England were not. Common people, people that read books, people who didn't read books, worked in factories. They thought it was kind of ridiculous for the British government to be aiding Jefferson Davis in trying to break up the United States. What did the United States do to them? But Mr. Darwin was in favor of the Southern secession. In the next great improvement in this theory was launched by Arthur Gobineau, a Frenchman who lived from 1816 to 82. He introduced a new element in this. He said that the blacks and the other inferior races were in competition with something that he called Aryans. He said this was a race which was actually fair-haired people that lived in different countries in the world. And they were the true aristocracy. If you weren't an Aryan, you were nothing. You weren't really good. So it was a very kind of romantic point of view, but importantly, it also related to this black question in the United States. France had, the French imperialists had a lot of interest in having slave colonies in Mexico, and also designs on Africa, even after the slave trade had been ended. There wasn't like everybody, there wasn't everybody in France that thought like that. There was especially some real lunatics like Gobineau. The next great advance was Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the son of a man named Neville something Chamberlain, not the one that became prime minister, but it's the same family. This is a British fellow who lived from 1855 to 1927, and he married the composer Richard Wagner's daughter, and he loved things German. What do you mean by German? Well, he meant the gods that live in the forest, and that like to commit suicide among crashing cymbals, and that he thought that's what you should identify as German. Don't talk to me about Beethoven or Bach. You know. And he moved to Germany and became a German citizen. And he wrote a book about updating this Aryan idea. He said that Aryans have lived all throughout history. They're the real secret of history. Why the people in Egypt were really Aryans, and in Greece and in Rome. And the reason, you know why Egypt fell and Rome? You didn't know this, did you? The reason that these countries fell is that the wrong races crept in and took away the power of the Aryans. See? Right? So if St. Augustine was an African, he must have been an Aryan too, right? Of course, this fellow didn't really like St. Augustine. He was on the opposite camp. He's a pagan. These are neo-pagans, as they were called at the time. And he was the principal organizer of what was called the Pan-German movement, that all us German people should get together and act stupid. The fact that he was British, he represented this British tradition, would that have to mean anything? You know, the Prime Minister of England at the time. And the President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt. Both of them were members of an organization started by Arthur Balfour called the Psychical Research Society, which believed in a very unusual form of life after death, which is ghosts, seances, and so forth. And they would practice seances. And usually this is a form of blackmail and cheap hoaxes and terrorism and stuff that's practiced on widows and so forth, you know, but it's also used by espionage agencies throughout time, and magicians and things like that. But they had this organization, which in my estimation is rather clearly a kind of a spy league, British organization. What's their point of view? Death is going to save us. You can talk to people after they're dead. There'll be less people if there's more death. Balfour wrote a book saying we should have a world war, because that way America would join Britain, and this runaway civilization would be controlled. I have some quotes from Balfour in that book right there. They set up in England a laboratory called the Galton Laboratory. I spelled it wrong here. At London University. A U.S. agency of that group was set up in Long Island called the Eugenics Record Office. It was financed by the Harriman family, by Averell Harriman's mother, at the insistence of Averell Harriman's sister. It was also then later financed by the Rockefeller family. The long-term president of the office was an executive of J.P. Morgan, and also fellow, an explosives and chemical maker in the United States named Matheson. They formed an organization then in the United States called the American Eugenics Society, and it set up its headquarters at Yale University. And in the United States in the 20s and 30s, Yale University was the center of the fascist movement. Every aspect of fascism, of racial theories, of experimentation on prisoners, experiments in brainwashing, every kind of dehumanizing experience. For example, in psychology, there were many different schools of thought. Some people thought you should psychoanalyze somebody. I think some of them were fruitcakes. But these guys make them look like saints, because these guys at Yale, everything they did there in psychology was on the line of What happens if you hurt somebody? How are they going to react? Can you control somebody by hurting them? By making them fear? So, the Yale University is a center of the Bush family. From the time of the 1920s, and Prescott Bush became a trustee and one of the most important directors of the university. All right. There was a famous meeting held in New York City at the American Museum of Natural History. People been there before? Have seen that? It's you see dinosaur bones in there, and there's a statue of Teddy Roosevelt out front on a horse. At this meeting, people came from different parts of the world. Averell Harriman made an arrangement with the Prescott Bush steamship company that he owned, but Bush and Walker and these guys were managers, to bring Germans over to New York for cheap rates to participate in this conference. And this was a meeting of the world leaders of eugenics. Now, the story that you get after World War II is that there was two different things. There was eugenics, or the way these crazy aristocrats thought in those days, the ones that were racist but they were sort of gentlemen. They thought one way, and then you had Hitler and the Nazis who were racist, and they killed the Jews. But really, that's not the way it was. You have to look at the primary sources, read what they said, read what they did, see what they did. Look at the proceedings of this meeting, which are available in many libraries. The primary concern of this meeting was Negroes. And they had a guy who came to this meeting from Virginia named W.A. Plecker. He's a real pathetic character. He was the commissioner of vital statistics in Virginia. Came up to New York. Of course, Harriman lived down in Virginia, even though he had his banking office in New York. He'd like to ride to the foxhounds, you see. They did that well, yeah. And Plecker came up to this meeting and he said, I keep records in Virginia on every family in Virginia, race records. And he would often send letters to mothers that just had a child, and he'd say, try to register that child as white, because I know that 5 generations back you have a Negro in India. And often he was bluffing, because he didn't have such records, but he got out of rumor or something. Now, unfortunately for his way of thinking, I mean, although it was very bad in Virginia in many ways, people kept having children and marrying and making love and doing all kinds of things that were not consulting him at all. But in any case, there's a fellow down there writing a life story of this pathetic character. He came up. There were exhibits about the intelligence of different races on display at this meeting. You see them in the proceedings. And they'd show you the most intelligent ethnic group or race, and then the lowest intelligent. Guess which one's the lowest? The Negro. Actually, as it turned out, it wasn't the English that got on the top. By any measurement, they couldn't force it somehow. Right? But what was the measurement? You know what the measurement was? How many patents were owned by different members of these different groups. That's the basic intelligence. Now, the fact is that the intelligence test, per se, is completely fraudulent. The whole concept of intelligence is totally fraudulent.
Right.
There is definitely an impairment of native intelligence by severe brain damage. Even the most severe brain damage can be overcome in some ways. Even a child born without a brain, but only a brain stem, can have intelligence that could even possibly be increased. This thing is almost virtually unknown. We don't know beans about how that works physically. And all these people are total fakers. these psychologists that are dealing with these things. They have another agenda. It's completely fake. It has something entirely different to do with politics than they're discussing. The whole idea of IQ is completely false. There's no bearing on anything at all. I'm not going to tell you how it works really. I'm just telling you what doesn't work. Because I don't know how it really works really. I know that if you love a child and give them a lot of stimulation and things that challenge them, you might get a good result. All right. Now, at this meeting, Averil Harriman's sister was in charge of entertainment. Old George Walker used to take Sis and Mom out to the races all the time. They owned a lot of racehorses. They learned about breeding humans by how they bred horses, they thought. And this meeting was dedicated to the memory of old Mrs. Harriman, the mother of Averil Harriman, who had given the money to set up this whole movement. Mr. Draper came. Mr. Draper was the owner of a company set up by Dillon Reed called German Credit and Investment. He was the other banker for Thyssen in New York City. He came to this meeting, and they elected at this meeting a man named Ernst Rudin from Germany to be the president of the World Federation of Eugenics Societies. He became their maximum leader. And of course they had people from the racial hygiene societies and the mental health societies, mental health, mental hygiene. Sterilize the ones that aren't mentally hygienic, so they won't have unhygienic children. Get it? So all these people were at this meeting. Rudin went back to Germany, and the next year he was asked by Hitler's interior minister, Wilhelm Frick, F-R-I-C-K, to create a new German race. Because, he said, the present German race is degenerate. Too many German babies are born that are inferior, that have low IQ, that are born with handicaps. 1 out of every 5 German parents, said Mr. Frick, is an inferior, degenerate parent. Build me a new German race. Of course, Mr. Rudin was the head of the Eugenics Society in Germany, and was also the head of all the Eugenics Societies centered in London. And they'd elected him that in New York. And he and a guy named Plutz organized a new unit of the German government called T4. Became very famous and notorious. They had a conference in 1935, sponsored by an Englishman named Julian Huxley, in Nazi Germany, about to look at what they're doing there and these new laws that they passed. What are these laws? If you are an alcoholic, or if you are a criminal, repeater, or if you're too old and weak and likely to die, or if you're a deformed baby, depending on your age and condition, you'd either be sterilized or you'd be murdered. This was called euthanasia, or mercy death. And it was carried out originally against Germans and Austrians. Who would protest against that? From another country. None of their business. What do they know about it? The organizers of this were psychiatrists, done under the direction of Rudin and Plutz and their organization. And the group was called T4, element in the government. They set up eugenical sterilization and killing units in Germany and Austria. And the Nuremberg trials after the war established that they had killed about 275,000 people this way. And they trained doctors in being callous and not caring about their patients and being killers, or watching others kill while they did some other things. All of the people that carried out the killing on a larger scale were trained in this way, and the T4 organization supervised all of the mass murders in Germany. The next phase was the labor camps where people were worked to death. Certain ones were selected out to be killed. And the final phase in Germany was where they set up special camps in Poland, like Treblinka, Belsen, to do extermination on Jews by the millions. All of this was organized by this T4 unit that was under the new laws that were passed, which were quite a scandal when they were passed, because no one had ever heard of this except in Virginia, or Georgia, or Massachusetts, where they had 20 states had eugenical sterilization laws in the United States, and the Germans modeled their laws on U.S. state laws for sterilizing unfit people. They just took it a step farther, right? That was phase 3. Phase 2 is with the German Credit and Investment Corporation, headquartered in Newark, New Jersey, and Berlin, Germany. Vice President, Director, and Assistant Treasurer. And in fact, the representative of the owners of this company, which is Bill and Reed, who themselves were operating in a structure that led up to the Bank of England. But he is the guy that ran it. He ran the money conduits into Thyssen. He ran the money conduits out of Thyssen for investment abroad. He sold Thyssen's bonds, and so forth. And in fact, together with Kuhn Loeb, they tried to swindle little bondholders in New York after Hitler took over. They said, Hitler's not going to pay what you loaned to the German companies before, because he has to use that money over there for building tanks. My father sued these German companies in the 1930s to force them to pay their debts to bondholders. He tried to stop Hitler in a very small way. And actually, one of the cases he had was this Hamburg American shipping line. They had merged with another German company. They had a ship called the Europa, and it was in New York. And they weren't going to pay their debts to the small bondholders. They were only going to pay it to the international banks. So my dad got a writ from the sheriff in New York to tie up this 30,000-ton liner until this lady got her $30. And they had to do it. Anyway, so he's a banker to Thyssen and the German Steel Trust, along with Prescott Bush. In 1943, he left that business with a little problem. The U.S. is at war with these people. Oh well, it reminds you of the way the Bush and these people deal with things. You give weapons to somebody, make sure there's a war, and then after a while, the same guy you gave the weapons to, you say he's like Hitler. You got to go invade his country. Same guy disarmed. Well, he should know about it, like Hitler, and so forth, right? So 43, Draper leaves. He goes to join the army. He's a banker. They don't send him to the German front. It'd be a little embarrassing to send him over to the Pacific Ocean. In 1945, though, at the end of the European War, he comes to Germany, and he's appointed head of the economic section of the U.S. control in Germany. He's in charge of taking down the Nazi cartels. Why? Because he knows a lot about them. He's in charge of deciding who gets exposed as a financier for the Nazis. He's in charge of, really, who gets punished as somebody that promoted the Nazis. Guess what? He didn't get punished. In 1946, to help him in his work, Averell Harriman was appointed Secretary of Commerce. John J. McCloy, the head of the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations, was in charge of the whole effort over there in Germany. So he made sure that the right people got off and the wrong people, and some of the lower down people got punished. In the early 1950s, He worked for Averell Harriman in the U.S. government. He's now called General Draper, because he's in the Army Company here in the Pacific. In 1959, he was the head of a panel to look into military aid for other countries in the U.S. And he recommended that the U.S. government get into the business of stopping the countries in South America, Africa, and Asia from having babies. This was the first instance where the government was called upon to get into that activity. In the 1960s, he founded a group called the Population Crisis Committee, and he became Undersecretary of State for Population Affairs. And the U.S. government began, not so strangely, financing that kind of activity to stop the wrong people from having babies in other countries. So-called General Draper, William H. Draper Jr., had a son named William H. Draper III. He was the co-chairman for finance of the George Bush for President Committee in 1980. And he is now the head of the United Nations Development Activities. He runs these activities in the Third World, for the whole world. I'll tell you what some of those activities are in a minute, but you can probably guess. They're not very wholesome. This is where George Bush gets his population theory from his close family friendship with this church. I'm running out of space here. Somebody could probably just paste these up. Can you just do that? Over there. It says all right, so that's one friend of George Bush, Draper, right? Now, here's another friend. You probably won't remember this name. There's going to be a quiz at the end, though. William Stamps Farish was the chairman. I'm sorry to say, I don't remember whether he was a president or chairman of Standard Oil, but he was the chief executive in the Hitler period. In 1942, he came under investigation by the Senate committee headed up by Harry Truman, senator at that time, because the Standard Oil Company had been the partner for a long time of E. Farben, and they had set up this thing called Auschwitz. And plus, they had made patent restrictions that gave to Nazi Germany the use of artificial rubber and so forth, and not to the United States. And we're in a war with them. And they still kept these agreements going. And they were pumping gas for Hitler throughout the war. So this guy was called before the Senate, and he was grilled. Now these guys, come on, they knew about this from a long time before, but now everybody's supposed to send their sons to go fight and die. So this is now a hot issue for a senator, right? So they put this guy under the grill. And he collapsed and died. He was mortified. He was exposed. His son was an Army Air Force. I think he was a pilot. He was something in the Army Air Force. And he was totally mortified. And he died, it was supposedly an accidental death in that same period during the war. The family was crushed. Died very young, as a junior. Now, William Stamps Farish III, who is presently the chief heir to the Exxon fortune. Exxon used to be Standard Oil. He and his father and grandfather were very close with Prescott Bush. Prescott Bush was, among other things, he organized the Dresser Company. It's an oil equipment company. And for the Harriman Bank, he did this. And he managed the whole thing. He organized their finances. And they were very close to Standard Oil. They got to know, they intermarried and so forth. So these people are very close. So William Stamps Farish, with this money, made in this way, think about that. He's the guy that lives part of the time in Kentucky. He's based in Houston. And when Queen Elizabeth comes over to the United States, she only stays in one house, and that's his house. He's a big mystery man. He's got investments all over the world, and they get arrested, and they die. But that's kind of stupid. That's not really a very scientific theory. He was taking British politics and putting that into natural science. That's not really a very scientific thing to do. It's easy to prove there were dinosaurs, and anybody who says that they weren't, or that they came from flying saucers or what have you, is not paying attention to what's being discussed. Darwin wrote his book after studying Malthus. And he said, Malthus has given me a great light. And he wrote his book in 1859 when there was one Darwin. Everybody thought that man came into existence in one instant, 4,000 years before, according to the Bible, according to a literal reading, somebody's literal reading in the Bible. And that Darwin overthrew that theory and used dinosaur bones to prove it. Now this is just not true, and he didn't claim that himself. What happened was there was a phony debate in England by the Church of England. They said, if what Mr. Darwin is saying about evolution is true, that proves there's no God. If there was previous history before, 4000 BC, that proves there's no God. I don't think it proves anything without thinking. And a few people sat in a banking office somewhere in a city off in another country. Darwin was on the side of the Southern Confederacy in the U.S. Civil War. Now, most people in England were not. Common people, people that read books, people that didn't read books, worked in factories. They thought it was kind of ridiculous for the British government to be aiding Jefferson Davis and trying to break up the United States. What did the United States do to them? But Mr. Darwin was in favor of the Southern secession. In the next great improvement in this thing, but it was a badly conceived debate. Darwin actually wrote about what he said was the way that nature changed. Why does nature change? Why do new species come about? Why do animals change from generation to generation? And how did he account for that change? He said that, well, it's sort of like what happens in the business world. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The rich animals succeed and the poor animals get crushed. Great subject before the world. And that subject was black chattel slavery. It was the most violently argued about, most important subject at the time in the world. Because the following year, Abraham Lincoln would be elected president. The British would give guns and ammunition and money to the slave owners' rebellion in their last attempt to physically break up the United States. And the people who thought like Malthus in the world, like these old Dark Age creatures that wanted to have feudalism come back to the world, they preferred empires where people worked as serfs.